House Oversight Chair James Comer weighed in on the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank. Let's hear what he had to say.
And then we see now coming out that they were one of the most woke banks in their quest for the ESG type policy and investing. This could be a trend, and there are consequences for bad Democrat policy. And I think we need to keep an eye on all the banking sector right now.
NBC News reporter Ben Collins tweeted, "I'm telling you, they're actually running with the woke banks thing. They're already using scary placeholder acronyms, ESG and DEI, which to them mean diversity. It serves to obfuscate the reality. There was a panicky bank front run by some of the GOP's biggest donors." Entrepreneur and 2024 presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy joins us now to discuss. Welcome back to the podcast. Back to the show. That's an old habit of mine. All right, Vivek. So what do you make of this? Let's start with this conversation about whether or not wokeness was really the cause here. You've been a critic of ESG in the past. Was that a meaningful factor here?
I don't think it's the central part of the story. I have been, believe me, I'm the biggest critic I know of the ESG movement and woke capitalism in America. That's not the heart of this story. This is a story about crony capitalism, where Silicon Valley Bank engaged in a bunch of risk-taking behavior, a bunch of tech startups that banked with them, over-concentrated with Silicon Valley Bank. Those are mistakes the market ought to punish. That's how the free market works. Competitors who make better decisions win. Competitors who make poor decisions lose. But actually, nonetheless, the Biden administration came to the rescue for a bailout of Silicon Valley tech and these tech startups, these well-funded venture-backed tech startups at that. Now, there's an element here, though, that is relevant, which is that if this had been an oil and gas bank that no one had heard of in the middle of Oklahoma with a bunch of oil and gas firms as its clients, I have little doubt in my mind this would have not gotten the bailout that it did. And this is a bailout. I'm using that word intentionally. And I'm happy to say more about why it is a bailout, despite the fact that Biden says it's not. But because it's in the heart of Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley Bank and its cronies have bent at the temple of identity politics and ESGism, because Silicon Valley Bank was the one that even just a year ago, think about this, made a $5 billion commitment to sustainable finance, making for a healthier planet rather than a healthier balance sheet, they got to be perceived as one of the good guys that needed to be saved. So I do think it's an element of the story, but I'm not pretending like it's the heart of it. But I do think that this idea of either pretending that that was the whole story or dismissing it just because some Republicans are saying it, but not in the most eloquent way, both miss the point.
So I agree with you that it's a bailout. I think it should be called out as such. I think people that have opposed previous bailouts, as I have, in whatever sector we're talking about, ought to oppose this one too. There's nothing more especially more deserving about the people involved here that they should get a bailout. And I've seen you, so I'm happy that you're describing it that way. And I've actually seen you kind of clashing or arguing with some folks, some of them even on the right, but in the tech space, who think this time it ought to be different. What are the David Sachs type people missing here?
I think they're missing the blinders of self-interest that caused them to see a situation that they would have seen the same way I do on first principles, but their proximity in Silicon Valley and their raw financial self-interest caused them to take a different position now instead. Okay, these are supposedly beloved libertarian free marketeers who, when their own situation goes south, wants the government bailing them out. And so even a lot of the weekend, this whole Silicon Valley crowd was fear-mongering the whole time, almost as though they were rooting for a bank run this week because that would have justified a bailout for their portfolio of companies. Well, the reality is companies like Roku or other tech companies should not have been concentrating hundreds of millions of dollars at Silicon Valley Bank. The reason they did wasn't just stupidity. Many of them got private benefits, like venture debt, like other private benefits that Silicon Valley Bank provides to founders. So they weren't necessarily dumb. They got private benefits that the American people will never enjoy. But when those risks go south, they still want the American people to save them. That is cronyism. It is corruption in the highest form. And many of these people, I don't care if they lean right or left. This is not a right-wing or left-wing issue. This is an issue about fighting corruption. And I'm sorry to say, yet again, cronyism won the day in the end here. And I will not stop until we have smoked this out. And I'm running for president to reform a broken system that makes this happen again and again, whether it's Republicans or Democrats that are responsible for it.
What do you see as the limits of what the government should do to protect depositors here? Do you fundamentally agree with the idea of $250,000 of deposits being insured by the FDIC? Do you support people who say that the real issue here is that the cap should just be somewhat higher, or that the stress tests that were gotten rid of under the Trump era with the support of about 17 Democrats should have been in effect, so that the risk-taking behavior would have been mediated by the fact that they should have anticipated having high interest rates at some point in the future. Are those kind of regulations things that you support, or would you fundamentally say that the free market should take care of all of this, and that no depositor in the country should have their deposits insured even up to the $250,000 amount?
So my first principle is same rules of the road for everyone, state them in advance, and then apply them evenly. But what I'm dead set against is changing the rules in retrospect. Do I think there's reasonable room for leadership to prevent bank runs in America? Of course, nobody wants a bank run. I think the way you do that is the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort through clear communication and willingness to do that, to actually play the role, one of the few roles the Fed was actually set up to play. I think the Fed is also responsible for this crisis in a deeper sense because they've been trying to play God for the last 20 years, instead trying to balance unemployment with inflation, which they've done a horrendous job of. As president, I'm going to actually reform the Fed to abandon that expansive scope and go back to doing the few things they were supposed to do. Number one on the list is actually to stabilize the dollar as a stable unit of measurement, which we've completely lost. So I think that's the real problem here is with the Federal Reserve. But I do think if you want to avert a bank run, I'm all in favor of that, but do it prospectively. Apply the same rules of the road to everyone instead of picking favorites in reverse, which is exactly what happened here.
Just to clarify, I think you said in a recent Fox News interview that more regulation is not the answer. Did you mean that more regulation after the fact is not the answer, but you do support regulations like putting back the stress test regulations into effect, perhaps increasing the amount that banks have to pay into the FDIC fund that would cover these deposit amounts, and perhaps also raising the level at which depositors are insured above the $250,000 mark?
I go in a slightly different direction. What I say is we need to let the market work and deregulate, but without this shadow assumption that the government's actually going to bail them out in the end. If the government's really going to be responsible for bailing them out in the end, that's a system that I don't want to sign up to. But in that system, I'm sympathetic to the idea that you need risk limits and you need capital requirements. The dirty little secret with Silicon Valley Bank is they're the ones that actually lobbied for a very long time, saying that they were not systemically important. That's why they could operate according to lower risk limits until the bell tolled for them. And then this last weekend, it completely reversed the story to say we are systemically important, which the Treasury Department vindicated by on Sunday night saying it's an emergency, they're systemically important, and actually using the public to bail them out.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be pedantic, but just to clarify, you could very well characterize the $250,000 amount as a bailout, right? As well, a bailout of depositors.
It's not because it's
so I just want to see
perspective.
what the distinction is between, or how one can go ahead and make the distinction between this amount that we all have accepted is protected for all depositors in the country and what is being characterized as a bailout over that amount.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it, right? So what I call a bailout is after the fact, changing the rules to help someone who took risks that they privately would have gotten rewarded for, but when it goes south, the public changes the rules and bails them out afterwards. That's my definition of a bailout. So if $250,000 is the cap and those are the rules of the road, anyone collecting that insurance when they're signing up to a bank, that's fair game because a bank pays into that FDIC, but they pass that cost on to the customer. So the customer is actually participating in a system of insurance that they pay into that they deserve to get paid out at the level that they signed up for. The problem here is we said $250,000 to ordinary Americans, but when Silicon Valley Bank had a tough time and when those tech startups were in trouble, we then said, actually, those rules don't matter for you. That's just the rules for everybody else. For an oil and gas bank and its clients in Oklahoma, that's what we would have done. But for you guys, we're changing it after the fact. That's what makes it a bailout. Now, I think there's reasonable debate to be had of whether that $250,000 number, which was set in, I think, 2009, we've had, a lot of inflation and price appreciation since then. Should that number be adjusted? I think those are all reasonable conversations to have. But this week, the most important observation to make is if you want to do that prospectively in a thoughtful way as a policymaker, not shooting from the hip and picking favorites, which is exactly what happened in the last 72 hours.
I think it's an important message. Thank you so much, Vivek, for joining us to explain it. Vivek Ramaswamy, thank you.
Thank you.
More Rising right after this.